Good afternoon and welcome to Good Friday and our consideration of the events of that first Good Friday long ago. I'm glad you're with us. Take a moment if you haven't and send a comment along that says that you're here. Just a reminder that tonight at 7 o'clock we will gather for a service of Tenebrae, reading the story of Jesus' crucifixion, and I hope that you'll join us for that. Tomorrow evening at 7, we will have the Great Vigil of Easter, an abbreviated version, and we will kindle the Easter fire, God willing, and the weather cooperates, and tell the stories of God's saving action through history. Then on Sunday morning, we'll be together at 8:30 or 10:30 here on the Facebook page for Easter Sunday worship. Please have bread and wine or grape juice available as we will celebrate communion as part of our Easter celebration. So, we've got quite a few of you here. It's good to have you all with us. We're dealing with Mark's account of the trial, the abuse, and the crucifixion of Jesus. You can find it as the entire 15th chapter of Mark's Gospel, verses 1 through 47. I'm not going to take time to read all of that. I'm sure you have things that you need to get done, and we'll be reading all of it tonight as part of our Tenebrae. But whenever we come to Good Friday, and especially Mark's account of Good Friday, we have to face substitutionary atonement once again. This is probably the most familiar understanding of Jesus' death that currently exists. The idea that Jesus died for the sins of the world. This is a part of a much larger package, that notion that we are all sinners. The idea goes that in order for God to forgive, a substitutionary sacrifice must be made, and the sacrifice would need to be perfect. Jesus was not only human, but also the Son of God, perfect, spotless, and without blemish. Go back to the book of Exodus and take a look at the qualifications for the Passover lamb, without blemish. So Jesus' death is so that we can be forgiven. Now that's the common understanding, the most widely dispersed view. But it's not the only understanding of Jesus' death. The substitutionary theory of atonement goes far beyond what the New Testament says and teaches. It also asks us to understand God as a God who requires blood, that needs a life for a life, a God that needs to be appeased. I'm not sure that's what we should be dealing with. Let's look at Mark's account. And the trick about looking at any single Gospel's account is that we tend to hodgepodge together a whole homogenized account using all of the gospel stories and Paul's writings and anything else we can lay our hands on. We can't allow any of that to happen. We have to allow Mark to tell the story he wants to tell us. Mark tells his story in precise 3-hour intervals, from 6 a.m. to 9 a.m. Mark places Jesus before the Roman governor Pontius Pilate early in the morning. This most likely happened in the security of the palace of the late Herod the Great, which is where the governor would often stay when in Jerusalem. We read in Mark's Gospel that the crowd cried for Barabbas and for Jesus' crucifixion. But this is almost certainly not the same crowd we read about on Palm Sunday and have been reading about throughout the week. For security reasons alone, the common folk would not have been permitted into the governor's palace. These are more like ardent fans at a political rally who sit behind the speakers so that we can see them. This crowd was invited by the religious leaders who collaborated with the imperial authorities. They have stacked the deck. Both Barabbas and Jesus are revolutionaries. Barabbas is violent, Jesus is nonviolent. They cry for Barabbas. And by the year 66, this Jerusalem crowd and many others had chosen the way of Barabbas, violence, not the way of Jesus. The destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in 70 AD make that clear. From 9 a.m. to noon, crucifixion. Crucifixion was a form of Roman imperial terrorism. The Romans did not invent crucifixion, but reserved it for very special victims. Not just capital punishment was crucifixion, but it was a very specific type of capital punishment saved for those who subverted Roman authority and disturbed the Pax Romana. It was a calculated deterrent, and it had to be as public as possible to attain its fullest effect. What made it so effective was not just the amount of suffering or even the humiliation that was involved, but the fact that there might be nothing left behind or allowed for burial. Though Jesus was given honorable burial in a tomb, other victims were often crucified so close to the ground that not only carrion birds could reach them, but also scavenging dogs. There was often little left for burial, and what was left would most often be thrown into the dump. From 12 until 3, Mark speaks of darkness covering the land. This darkness is most likely a literary device that Mark is employing. Some suggest that there was a total eclipse, but if you remember just a couple of years ago when we had a total eclipse, it was only dark for a few minutes. This sounds like it lasted for hours. Supernatural darkness is probably also quite unlikely. Darkness has been an archetypal image that's often associated with suffering, mourning, and judgment. It's entirely possible that Mark is using darkness as a literary device to tell his story. From 3 until 6 p.m., the curtain of the temple was torn in two. It has a twofold meaning. It is a judgment upon the temple and the temple authorities who collaborated with the Romans to bring about Jesus' death. It is also an affirmation that the execution of Jesus means that there is now access to the presence of God. This is a reaffirmation of Mark's point made earlier in the gospel that Jesus offered access to God apart from the temple and the domination system that it had come to represent. And the presence of women. The presence of women reminds us that Jesus' male followers had abandoned him and fled. Perhaps it was safer for the women to be near without being suspected as subversives. 6 o'clock in the evening. Joseph of Arimathea goes to Pilate to request the body of Jesus. It's a courageous move. He is doing something politically unwise. He is aligning himself with Jesus over Pilate. And he's doing so as a member of the council that collaborated in Jesus' death. Is Joseph a failed disciple? Or is Joseph, a subversive? Unlike many of the victims of crucifixion, Jesus is buried in a tomb. The women know where the tomb is. The stage is set for Easter. But let's come back to Mark and the way he's told his story. When it comes to supporting an idea like substitutionary atonement, Mark is completely lacking in any such understanding. How does Mark see Jesus' death? As execution, because of his challenge to the domination system. Did Good Friday have to happen? A divine necessity? No. A human inevitability? Virtually. As Mark tells the story, Jesus was guilty of nonviolent resistance to imperial Roman oppression and local Jewish collaboration. Mark's story of Jesus' final week is a sequence of public demonstrations against and confrontations with the domination system. And we all know it was that system that killed Jesus. Our brief statement of faith reminds us that Jesus was unjustly condemned for blasphemy and sedition, suffering the depths of human pain. That's what we should be keeping in mind on a Good Friday afternoon. If it were to happen today, would we be complacent and complicit with the unholy alliance of religion and politics? Are we comfortable with it now? It's hard questions. That's okay, because Good Friday's a hard day, made even harder this year. So that's what I have for you today. I'll take a couple of minutes. I'll move over to the Facebook page. Submit some questions or thoughts that you have on this Good Friday afternoon. I'm glad you could be with me today, and I hope this was helpful and insightful as to the events of Good Friday afternoon. I think one of the most important things we can remember is that these texts, though precious to us, are unique, worthy of deep study, and they should never be used as texts of terror to attack another group, another religion. So, please, take time to read the story today. Join us again tonight at 7 for Tenebrae, and keep joining us throughout the following 2 days as we complete the story. I'm glad you could be with me. Have a good afternoon.